Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Philanthropy. On today's episode, I am very excited to bring in a wonderful friend of mine, and she's very courageous. We did a master's program together. Her name is Kelli Fredlund, and I'm really excited because we met recently and we started talking, and of course, me, typical Jess, I was like, oh my God, this conversation is so good. Could we do it again on my podcast? And she was as wonderful as she is. She said, yes, of course. So welcome, Kelli.
Well, thanks for having me, Jess. I'm excited to be here today and chat with you. And again, it's just always fun meeting up with you and having conversations. So that's how I'm going to treat this day, just as a conversation.
Good. And that's what I want because, and I'll just give everybody a little bit of background. When we were doing our master's program, actually Kelli was in the very first class that I ever took. And when I joined that class, I remembered thinking, gosh, I don't know if I want to do this. I went into my master's program with such a terrible attitude. I didn't want to do it, but I was already a principal and I felt like I should have some credentials to back me, and maybe a master's would help me to learn. And so, I went in and I was basically like, okay, you know what? I'm going to just do this to get the check mark and to just say I did it. And really, I think in that first meeting, Kelli was in a group with me and she was just such a bright, shining light. I'm not even kidding. Our meeting was so incredible. She's so positive, and I guarantee every single person that crosses her path loves her immediately. And that was my case where I think I had confessed to you that I was like, oh, I don't know if I want to do this. I don't know if I want to be here. And Kelli, of course, was like, you're going to do great. This is going to be so good for you and you're going to love it. And I stayed. So thank you, my friend. I think you had a huge impact on me.
I'm so glad you stayed, Jess. And I think anybody going into a master's program, me for certain, I hadn't gone back to school for 20 years, right? I graduated, I'd gone into the teaching profession, and I just thought, okay, I had children, and I thought this is a good time for me to enter back in now to my master's program and learn again. And I was scared. And so you equally calmed me in that meeting. And I can remember thinking, can I do this? And you and I were kind of commiserating together, but here we are. We did it. And now you moved on and you're doing big things. And I'm trying to incorporate a lot of things that I learned in my master's program back in the schools that I'm working in. So it was great on a number of levels.
It really was. And then of course, we stayed in touch, definitely built a really good friendship, and then we met for coffee recently, and it was at coffee, of course, you had asked me about my podcast, and it's been my life for the last few months. But when we were having that conversation, I had confessed to you that, something that was on my mind and it was really important. At one point in my life, I don't know how many years ago this was, maybe, I don't know, I'm going to say what is it, 2026? So I think probably 2020 was the last time I wrote a column. And so I had been a columnist for a few newspapers. Three, I was a columnist for Eagle Feather News and for Prince Albert Daily Herald and the Moose Jaw Times Herald. And so in that time, it was a number of years that I was doing columns. I had a lot of columns about the race relations in Saskatchewan. And of course, you live here and I live here, and often what happens is there's not a lot of dialogue between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, and there's a lot of maybe misunderstanding, and then you go to the comment section on any article, and it was on my columns also, and you get a lot of negativity, and I had said to you, when we were having our coffee date, that I would love to be able to have somebody brave brave enough to come on my podcast and talk about some of these things with me. And they're tough topics, and I get it. And nobody wants to do it. And I think so many people are afraid of, oh my gosh, I don't want to say the wrong thing, and I don't want to offend people, and I don't want people to think I'm racist. And so I've been kind of looking around for somebody who could do this with me. And of course, to do it in a way that was positive and in a way to, see the good on both sides and not to just be chewing each other apart, right? And of course, I have a really good friend of mine, and I wanted her to come on also, but she's so very shy. And so I've been waiting and waiting for the right person. And then, of course, we're sitting there, and I was like, oh my gosh, it has to be Kelli. It all clicked together, and I was like, it has to be Kelli. And I know you're a Brené Brown girl, and I'm a Brené Brown girl, and and we're big on the courageous conversations, the vulnerability. And so, and I asked you, would you have these tough conversations with me? And I was so surprised that you actually said yes. Like, that's really amazing.
Well, you know what? And I think a lot of times it is fear that stops these conversations and not wanting to hurt or offend anyone else. And I have been a part of many conversations over the years, and some of them are hard. I mean, these aren't easy conversations to have. But I think when you've got trust and you've built a relationship with someone, then it's a lot easier to ask those hard questions. And I don't think these conversations come without that. So because I have a relationship with you, Jess, and because you know my heart,
Yep.
and because I know you and who you are and what you stand for and live for, I think it's definitely a lot easier to have those conversations because we understand each other at a different level as friends.
I think you're absolutely right. And maybe that's the problem, that when we go to the race relations, that there is an absence of a relationship there. And I think that's probably the problem. And I look around, and I come from an Indigenous background, and I grew up here, and I've been on this reserve and that reserve. I've worked on so many reserves. And I know for a fact that there are so many Indigenous people who don't have friends that are non-Indigenous. And I know that it's the same on the other side, right? That there's also a lot of non-Indigenous, and I say non-Indigenous to be inclusive, that it's not just white people, it's different immigrant communities, it's people who are not Indigenous. And there's not a lot of these relationships happening. There's a lot of staying within our own group and making a lot of judgments. And right now, I'm teaching a couple of university classes, and one of them is an Indigenous studies class and also an English class. And on the English class, we were talking about the difference of worldviews, right? And to me, it's really important because in our English course, we're doing a lot of decolonizing work. It's an Indigenous group that I'm teaching. And I wanted them to do that. But, we had to start there. We had to start at the worldviews and look at how incredibly different these worldviews are. And I said to these students, that's a huge key for us in this province, that people are not understanding each other because they think so differently, and they're not understanding. And so, I said, I think that when we even look back all the way to the treaty signing, that we had two worldviews sitting there and two completely different understandings of what a treaty meant. And then, of course, and we're still unpacking that to this day. And so you have a lot of frustration from a lot of Indigenous people who they had their understanding of the treaty signing. And then, of course, there was the legal document, the actual treaties. And so people are mad that this one has this right, and then over here, this one is mad because it's not being honored the way it should, that they were told orally, because a lot of people didn't read at that time on the Indigenous side. And so it's just continued. And here we are, how many years later, and people are still not talking, and we're still making a lot of judgments, and it's frustrating. And that was, I think, a part of the job that I did when I undertook the columns that I wrote, that I tried to unpack a lot of, the history for people to understand. And it's been an uphill battle. It's just it can be so challenging.
Well, and I just feel honored to be able to have this conversation with you because
Mm.
that you would trust me to ask these questions and have these hard conversations with. I grew up, a little bit of my history, I grew up in a farming community in southern Saskatchewan. There wasn't a lot of coming and going of different families and different people. So it was pretty stagnant in on that side of things, I would say. There were a lot of white people in my school that I grew up in. It was just the same white community members that there always had been. There wasn't anybody of any color or any different race in my school. So that's how I grew up. That was the diversity that I experienced, right? And so I knew what I knew. I had a strong farming, again, it was a farming community, a strong religious background. And then I moved to Saskatoon to go to university. And yes, we read stories and as much as education was then, I can remember thinking as a teacher now, and what we have as a part of our school curriculum, and what I learned in terms of anything about Indigenous people
Yep.
and people other, right? I
Mm.
didn't have a lot of depth in my programming. And so it has been ever since I left my high school, went in through university, but it has really been my education in education
Hmm.
that I have learned so much. And I look at schools now and what we're learning and the relationships that we have that we're developing in classrooms. And I think this is hope. Like for me,
Hmm.
I see hope in the future of this. And I see diverse classrooms and a lot of talking and a lot of conversation and a lot of education about what it means to be sharing this land.
Hmm.
We have a long way to go, but I do have hope that the conversations are richer than they ever have been, and the relationships are stronger, are growing stronger. So I'm hopeful that it's not going to be generations and generations and generations before we do see a different world than you have, like, been trying to be a strong voice for your people in this situation. I don't know. I see hope for Saskatchewan.
Mm. I really love that. Thank you for sharing that. I do think that, at the end of the day, and I think, we'll look at something like the Truth and Reconciliation recommendations, right? The TRC recommendations, and I think there's 94 or something like that, and some of them apply to education. And, and it really makes me hopeful too that you think, that there's more diversity and that sort of thing, because I think it can be so frustrating for a lot of Indigenous people. And I know a lot of times people feel like, why does it have to be my job as an Indigenous person to constantly be teaching and constantly be sharing? And why is the onus on us to, be bringing out this kind of information? And then when I think of someone like you, and my experience with you has been that consistent support, that true allyship, right? Like, we're talking allyship in the sense of understanding where you come from, and challenging maybe some of the ideologies that are running through our systems right now, and the impact it has on education and on ourselves. Like, when I look at you, you're somebody who is so very open-minded, and you lead with your heart. And I think that's, of course, a huge reason why you and I have been able to connect so well, right? Because we're able to have those conversations. And, I look at, some of my friends and I've had to have those conversations too. And again, you're right. It's, having that trust, having that relationship that when I'm going to say something, I might preface it with something like, I don't know if this sounds racist, because I say it too, right? And I always say that I'm half German because I am. My late father was German, but of course I was raised very Cree. And I remembered having a conversation with one of my white friends, and I remembered saying something like, "Oh, and I'm white passing," and she said, "Well, why do you say that?" And I said, I don't know. Like, it's something that a lot of Indigenous people who are kind of fair, we say that we're white passing because, it might indicate that maybe we have more privilege in a situation than somebody who looks visibly more Indigenous, is maybe more darker. And she's like, Kate, when I look at you, she's like, in all honesty, I don't think a lot of white people are going to think you're white. And so she's like, I don't think you need to say that. And I was like, huh, right? And, that was something that I had never considered, but this is one of the things that a lot of Indigenous people say. And then after she said that, she's like, they might not know outright when they look at you that you're for sure Cree or something like that, but they know you're not white.
Jess, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
What is a good ally in terms of allyship? Other people who may be watching this today.
Yep.
What does a good ally look like? What does a good ally sound like? How can we be better?
Right. That's such a great question. Thank you. I think it's when a person recognizes that if, like, let's say you are a white person, right? That you are born into a certain kind of privilege. You do have white privilege. And by recognizing and understanding that you're born into privilege, you have power to help dismantle a lot of the systemic racism that exists in our organizations. And you can help to push it in a way that an Indigenous person or a person of color doesn't have the same connections, doesn't have the same power, and sometimes, and again, that might be a collaboration thing because you might not always see where something feels unjust, right? But that's when you're having a conversation with somebody, in the organization, in the school, in wherever you work, and they're saying, God, this is really unfair. And for you to recognize and say, hey, wait a minute, I've never noticed that because it hasn't applied to me. But they're right. And that's not fair, and what do we do to dismantle that so that there is more equity in these organizations? And not to say equality, because equity is different from equality, right? And that as an educator, that equity means we're putting everybody kind of on the same level playing field, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the same rule applies to everybody across the board. That's the difference, right? If you think of, equality, I there's a meme or some kind of an image out there, and I think you know which one it is. Yeah. It's, there are three kids and they're looking over, I'm going to say like an arena wall, and they're looking at some kind of game that's playing, and they have three different heights, and there's three different boxes. Now, the three people of the three different heights, if we're looking at it equality, everybody gets the exact same height box. But that doesn't do anything, because if they all stand on it, we still see that difference, right? But equity means that one person maybe doesn't need the box. The next person has a medium-sized box, and the next person has a higher box, so that all three are standing and they can view it exactly the same. And that's equity, right? And so when we're talking about allyship, it's understanding that you were born into having a specific privilege that gets you into doorways, that gets you into conversations where power is moved, because that's where power originates in our country. When we look at, the power structures that exist, they were, it comes from colonization, and it comes from, people who generally have, and of course that's changing in government now, but at the time when it was set up, it was a colonial system. And so, and it's embedded with colonial thought, and then that doesn't incorporate Indigenous thought, right? And, of course, there's going to be some Indigenous people listening, and they're going to say, well, we have sovereignty, and it's supposed to be sovereign nations and that sort of thing. And absolutely, 100%. When we did the treaty signings, it was nation to nation. It wasn't being conquered by another nation. They weren't agreeing to a colonial system that was going to run their lives. Their interpretation was they were going to be sovereign nations that shared the land, coexisted together. But that's not what we see in the government, right? And so, of course, we have the Indian Act, and, we have all kinds of, right? And so then when we consider, the power structures that now govern the Indian Act and govern Indigenous people in this country, it is that constant fight, I think, of Indigenous people saying we should have more power and maybe not being invited to the conversation, right? And so a real ally is going to say, hey, wait a minute, let's go back and let's revisit these treaties. Let's go back and revisit these conversations, the conversations that were maybe never had, and conversations that need to be had. And, and then, of course, recognizing, that there's more people in this country too now, right? We have a lot of immigrant populations, and what does that look like, right? So I don't know. I hope I did justice to that answer. I feel like people are gonna reach out to me and say, you know what you forgot?
You know what? It's impossible to have a conversation like this and not forget things or not miss out on things. I think it's important though to note that as we move through this, I mean, we both have a lived experience. Yeah. And I think the important part is that we try to understand each other. And unless you talk to one another, you don't understand.
Right.
And you don't get to that new level of understanding, you're stuck. Yep. And I think because there's a lot of division, people can be nice to each other, right? Yeah. And people can say hi and bye, but it's that kindness is action and another level of understanding. And so I feel like because kindness is action, it's doing something.
That's right.
And I felt stuck initially, especially as an educator, because I'm like, I don't know enough. What if I give misinformation? And I don't want to do that.
Right.
But when I've been talking to a variety of people over my career, and they said, do something. So that is, I have to do something because of the privilege that I have and that I carry. It's an obligation. That is reconciliation, is doing something, even if it's little.
Right.
And conversations and just challenges, small challenges along the way add up over time. And they do make a difference.
Right. And, I love that you're saying that, because I believe when we were having coffee the other day, this was one of the things that we had talked about, that, sometimes non-Indigenous people, they're tasked with teaching about treaties or some sort of Indigenous content. And they often will say, but I don't feel knowledgeable enough. I don't feel like I'm going to do this topic justice. So what do I do in that situation? Because I don't know enough and I don't want to teach it the wrong way. And then I think what I had shared with you was you don't have to teach it. That's where you bring in an Indigenous person and you acknowledge, I do not know enough about this topic. Let me go and get a knowledge keeper. Let me go get somebody in our community that exists right now. Let me make relationships relationships and bring in somebody
Yes.
who will do this topic justice. And that doesn't happen. And so I think, as an educator, often we feel like we have to know all of the answers. And I can't tell you how many times I say, as an educator, as a leader, as a professor, I don't know.
And that takes humility.
Let me try and find out, right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, you have to go from a humble place and you have to ask the questions, but you have to have people to ask the questions to. And sometimes when there's not those relationships that are in place,
Yep.
then you feel like, where do I go to ask these questions?
That's it.
And it's intimidating. I often got stuck in, what if I don't do the right thing? I know there's protocol here. I
Yeah.
don't want to offend the elder,
Yep.
right? So how do I offer tobacco? How do I do those steps to make sure that they know that I am coming genuinely to
Yeah.
ask them for their knowledge, for their support in a humble way, right?
Right. And you know what? I'll stop you right there because protocol, of course, that's an age-old tradition, and that signifies that you're coming with true intentions, you're seeking knowledge. And I'm going to tell you right now, flat out, for Indigenous people, we get it wrong too. Like there's different ways to do things in different territories. And, even for us, we have to ask about protocol too. And we have to make sure that we're not offending somebody, because even two reserves that are side by side might operate differently. They might do things differently. And like I said, I've worked in so many different nations in this province. I've lived in so many. And so I've seen things done very differently. And you know what? It's a humility thing for everybody. It's not just for non-Indigenous people, it's for Indigenous people too. The amount of elders that have gotten mad at me and have yelled at me and whatnot over the years, you just learn to accept it. And you go, okay, I'm sorry. And, and maybe it is a lesson in humility for everybody, but, don't feel bad. If that's you and you're not Indigenous and maybe you didn't get it right, it happens to us too. I've been
that
scolded.
makes me feel better, Jess.
I've been scolded a lot.
That makes me feel way better. To be honest with you, though, everybody who I've ever approached, any elder that I've brought, have said yes, they would come into my classroom, have been very gracious to me. If I've messed up, they haven't acted like I've messed up, and I know I have. So, yeah, when they come in, it's been really beneficial to me. I've learned a ton just by sitting and listening. And I know that kids do. So we can't, as an educator here in Saskatchewan, I think it's vitally important that we have knowledge keepers come into our classrooms and speak to our kids, because we all learn together.
That's really amazing. And also, I'm thinking now, when you mention these knowledge keepers coming into the classroom, of course, I was a principal in my past life, before my podcast life and my professor life. And
all these lives, Jess, so many lives.
I know.
So many jobs.
And I remember one time we had wanted to talk to the students about a specific topic. And, one of our non-Indigenous staff had organized it. And, we said, okay, we're going to bring in an elder to talk about this. And so then they came in and I sat through some of the talk and, and they were there. And after the talk, and the thing with a lot of times with Indigenous people is they'll talk in a more circular manner. They're not direct, right? Not all of them. Sometimes people will be, but often it's intended that way for you to pull out the lessons that apply to you. And so you're going to go home and unpack the lessons, and it can be a very different style of learning. And so sure enough, the person who organized this meeting with the students had come to my office, and they were non-Indigenous, and they said, Jess, I don't even think they talked about that topic at all. And I said, okay, we're gonna stop right there. the person who came in, they did address it, but they're old school, they're indigenous. And I said, and of course, you come from a different background, and that's where we're talking about the worldviews. And I
Mm-hmm.
said, you're used to bullet points. You're used to somebody giving you an agenda
Mm-hmm.
at the start, following the bullet points and doing it in a timely fashion with 60 minutes or, questions to spare, that sort of thing. And I said, it doesn't work that way in indigenous communities often, and you're going to have to maybe get used to that. I said, it's a little bit frustrating because it's very different. But then she said something to me, and she's like, could we offer two types of this talk, like, so that we represent the Western view and we also represent the indigenous view, and so that kids can learn in those two different ways? And I was like, you
Mm-hmm.
know what, that's actually a really great idea, because even as indigenous people, we're going through these processes of decolonizing our minds. We've been trained in Western thought in school systems since residential school.
Mm-hmm.
And so now we're trying to, revert back and, indigenize our own schools and curriculum. And that's not a bad idea to present two different views. And that's something that I've said with my own students, that I was like, I want it to be very clear that when we talk about the differences of Western doesn't necessarily mean bad. When I'm saying Western, I don't want you to internalize that, oh my God, they're the devil. I
Yeah.
don't, it's a way of thinking. And I said,
Mm-hmm.
our goal for our students, our indigenous students, should be, because they're going to walk in two worlds, right? They have their indigenous communities at
Mm-hmm.
home, and hopefully they have a lot of ceremony and cultural teachings. But they're going to operate in a mostly Western world, and they're going to
Mm-hmm.
have to know how to navigate that. And so it's not a bad idea to present these two different views, and to be able to just point them out and say, you know what, this is coming from a very Western way of thinking, and this is coming from a very indigenous way of thinking. And then that just helps you to become a critical thinker. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's adversarial, one is better than the other. That, you can recognize that these two entities can coexist at the same time and both be true.
And Jess, I think you hit the nail on the head really. When I first brought an elder into my classroom, I when I approached them, I said, would you be willing to come in? And they said yes. And I said, well, we're talking about these things in our classroom right now. And I kind of listed a few things because as a teacher, I'm adhering to a curriculum,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yep.
And I'm making sure these topics get covered, but I wanted a different perspective. I wanted an Indigenous perspective. And so the offering. And so the elder came in and spoke, and I myself had to step back and say, Kelly, this isn't about checking off a bunch of outcomes right now in the way that I'm used to. It was
Mm.
completely different. And so at the beginning, I was kind of like the other person you were talking about,
Yeah.
thinking, oh, did we even get to what I needed to get to?
Right?
But it's not always about that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's a new way of understanding. And I'm still learning. Every time I invite someone in, I again have to step back and step out of my comfort zone. And it might be not checking off the boxes I think my kids need, but what the elder believes that we need to hear.
Mm.
They're
Mm.
bringing in their gifts and their ideas and their stories and their lessons and all of the things they feel led to teach our students that day.
Mm.
And so I just have to let it be. And again, it's not about a 60-minute time period.
Yep.
Sometimes it's 25 minutes and sometimes it's longer. And we have to just sit, and it's whatever that the elder feels that is on their heart that day.
Mm. And I really love that you said that, because that goes to, the heart of maybe sometimes the differences that with Indigenous, at least the elders, often when they're coming in, it's like spirituality is so pervasive in every single aspect, especially for a traditional person, that it permeates everything. And so what you said, when they come in, they're speaking on what's on their heart, and that's going to come from, like, if you do anything with any Indigenous people, we always start with a prayer. I should have started my podcast with a prayer. I'm going to get in trouble for that now. Just kidding. But there's always that invitation of Creator into that space. And so that's definitely something that they would do before they even got there. Because, of course, they're going into a space that's also uncomfortable for them. Right? Like, it's uncomfortable for us to learn. And I can't tell you how many times that, I've worked with elders in the schools. We've had school elders, and, and I've been constantly, and we have Indigenous teachers. And I'm like, are you reaching out to the elders? Are you bringing in the elders? And the elders are like, well, I don't want to, go and force myself on these people. And that's a very Indigenous way to approach it, that they're going to wait, and if you want them to come in, then they'll come in, but they're not going to market themselves and say, this is what I do and I can come in, and if they do, like I said, we're in a process of decolonization, and some people they were really taught a lot in the residential school and on doing it this way, so sometimes there's a difference. But a lot of really traditional elders, I've had that conversation where, teachers, are you bringing them in? And then the elders are like, well, not really sure what they're doing in that class. I'm not really sure what they want me to talk about. So then they're going to have a moment of prayer, and they're going to say, Creator, just whatever you think I need to be teaching that group, then that's what I'm going to talk about, right? And even if you do, the situation where we brought in the elder and we said, hey, can you come and talk about this? And he kind of, talked about different things, then that can be very much part of that they're, maybe something happened in their own lives, and they're recognizing that there's a need to be sharing that with the youth. And then they do, right, after consulting Creator first.
I honestly, the most meaningful time that my class and I have ever had has been when we've been learning on the land. And that's where we meet our elder. And we had one of those great times when we were at camp in this fall with my class. And the elder, I don't know, it's just, they speak to the heart every time. And it's almost like they can see exactly who needs that story, who needs their knowledge and their wisdom. And they just, I don't know, it's this, I love it. It's just when you're on the land, it feels different than when you're in a classroom setting. And I don't know if it's just a comfort. I don't know if it's more genuine. I don't know why, but it feels different.
I mean, I would guess that it's because, especially for Indigenous people and learning on the land, like, there's that belief that everything has a spirit, right? Like, everything. And, when you're out there, like, Mother Nature just has a way of healing people, no matter who you are or what background you come from, right? And we've talked about that a few times on this podcast, that sometimes there's grounding exercises that we've talked about, and that's been my big thing this year. I'm always talking about grounding, and not in the sense of 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I see 5 things, and I hear 4 things. And that's a great exercise, and it roots you in that moment. And so I'm not saying that that's not a valuable teaching. It really is. But grounding in the sense of, like, removing your shoes, removing your socks, smushing your feet into the dirt, and by doing that, on a scientific level, there's the healing energies in nature, and a lot of it has to do with the energy that runs through the earth, and I can't even explain it. Like, I'm not a science nerdy girl, but there are currents, electrical currents that are running through the earth, and when you're connecting to it, and I don't know, I read some really great article and it was talking about all the things you could do to incorporate this into your life. You could have a picnic and sit on the earth, you could meditate on the earth, you could do more gardening, you could walk, and there was just a yoga, of course, that's big for me. And so all of these things that you could do, and I was looking at it from like a real sciencey kind of, oh yeah, that makes sense. And I've been saying that to a lot of Indigenous kids, when I've gone out and done some work with them recently, and I've been saying, like, this is something that your ancestors have done since time immemorial, and it's a practice that comes very natural to our culture, especially when we look at ceremonies and cultural things, that being connected to earth is so powerful. But something else too, and actually I did a podcast with a lady from New Zealand, she's Maori, and we were talking about grounding, and she said when you're connecting to the earth, you're connecting to your ancestors. And I was like, oh my God, that's so beautiful. And she's like, because of course we come from the earth and we go back to the earth. So there's that deep ancestral tie to the earth. And I was like, God, and once again, I was like, grounding is like the thing. I'm big on it. And for all of those reasons, like being in nature, it's healing for everybody. It doesn't even matter what your background is. I don't know, like there's some kind of magical power. And I think that's the danger, that sometimes when we're in the city too much and we have this tiny little designated park, and that's not to say that the trees in a park in a city aren't still amazing, but we just like put so much concrete on everything, and we live so disconnected in all of these buildings. And that's part of the problem with the grounding, that if we're not immersed in nature and we have all these barriers between us and the earth, these shoes and these concrete floors, that we become disconnected, and we need that healing energy inside of us. But if we're not in nature, then it's very disorienting to our spirit and to our body. Like, we do need that. Doesn't matter who you are.
I always think just a walk can heal you.
Yeah.
An outside walk, going for a walk, it clears your mind. And there's that healing power of just being outside in nature. It makes all the difference. And I've noticed too, when kids are heightened, right? If you've been in a room all day,
Yep.
you need to get outside. And the moment you get outside, it's just like, I got it. I'm okay. Right?
Yep.
It's that energy shift for sure.
Absolutely. Well, I don't know what time we're at, my dear.
Yeah.
Is there anything that's on your heart or your mind before we leave? Because I know this has been healing for me to have this podcast. And I feel like people are going to listen to this and maybe they'll say, hey, what about this topic? And what about this topic? So I feel like you're going to be back and we'll do more of these.
Well, honestly, I feel like there's so many questions regarding relationships and how we can have stronger relationships between one another and understand where one another's coming from.
Right.
I know that in education, I always think I want to do no harm.
Yep.
That's a big thing, that a phrase that runs through my mind all of the time, because I know that education has, in our past, done harm to our Indigenous people. And that is one thing that always is top of my mind. So I want to talk more to you sometime about things that educators can continue to do and continue to work on, so that we do no harm and that we benefit everyone. Yeah, that's a huge piece of a goal of mine, always top of mind when I'm leading groups, when I'm looking at the children in my classroom. How can I do no harm? How can we benefit everyone who's sitting in those desks? How can everyone get a strong education? How can everyone graduate? How can everyone get to a place where they're successful in whatever they choose to be? Um, I feel like that is a prominent thought and should be top of mind for everyone, especially in education.
I think that's really beautiful, and I think you're 100% right in that goal. That's a beautiful goal because it's hard to be human. Ultimately, at the end of the day, none of us chose the package we came in. We were born into whatever race you're born into, whatever gender you're born into, whatever age you are. Like we didn't choose those things. And I mean, okay, some people might say on a spiritual level, but
Yeah.
ultimately we didn't choose those things, but we're all here and we all matter. And we all have to coexist peacefully. And it's real challenging. But I think if you walk forward with love in your heart and peace in your heart, and you genuinely want to connect and you want everybody to do well and to prosper, then I mean, I'm happy you're an educator. Like, I'm happy you're in the schools. And I know all the kids that are benefiting from that, because we need more people to have those intentions in every facet of life, not just education, but everywhere we are. Like, we need to be better humans ultimately at the end of the day, right?
We need to see each other.
Yep.
We need to absolutely see each other.
Yeah.
And I feel like sometimes we look past each other.
Yeah. 100%, because we look at the package everybody came in and we start judging them. Even though I just finished saying not one of us picked that damn package we came in.
But again, it's about knowing one another and reaching out and forming relationships and learning about different perspectives. I know that no matter what role I'm playing in an environment, if I'm working through anything that I need to talk to someone about a certain situation that I might not know much about, I seek help. I ask questions. I try and learn, because we can't move forward unless we do that. And I, coming at everything from my own perspective and not seeing anybody else's, am missing something. So I don't know. It's just so important to reach out to other people, to ask questions, to learn, to understand, because we're not going to move forward if we don't.
And I feel like that's like at the heart of like true spirituality, right? Like understanding that we come in this package, and we're talking me, myself, and I, and all of the ego trappings that come with that. And how do we look beyond ourselves to community? How do we understand that we have one experience, but so many other people have something different, and we don't know unless we're building that community around us, right? And by doing that, we feel so less alone, because it's so easy in this human existence to feel so alone a huge amount of the time. And yet there are so many people around us. And if we start thinking about them instead of thinking about us, we're going to find more joy in our lives too. Because if it's just we're left to ourselves and our own devices, if we're not in nature all the time, then we could be pretty miserable.
Yeah, like, we need each other.
We do 100%. And I believe that we are born into community, because it takes a mother and a father in order to create life. And then so automatically we're born into at least 3 people, and then we need those people to nurture us and to help us to grow. Like, as humans, it is 100% vital that we have community for our health, our mental health, our emotional, spiritual health. And I think that's the problem right now in Saskatchewan, that we have a big disconnect. There's community that's not talking to each other. There's community that's not, even trying to make any kind of relationships. And I think that's why there's so much tension, right? Like,
reconciliation is not done alone.
Yep. Yep, exactly.
Reconciliation cannot be done alone. It cannot be done with one community versus another community. It has to be done together
That's right.
with mutual
Everybody.
understanding. It's
Yep.
going to take everyone.
Every single
Yeah.
person.
Yeah.
100%. Oh, I love you, lady.
Love you right back, lady.
Oh, thank you so much. This was amazing and so powerful. And I was thinking the other day, the amount of times I say powerful on podcasts. I was like, I think I need to think of new things to say after somebody says something amazing. Because I was listening to one of the podcasts and I think I said it 4 or 5 times in a row. Oh, that was so powerful. and that's not to minimize it. I really do think these are powerful thoughts.
Well, it's important conversations.
Yeah,
All of
that's
these
right.
conversations are important. So I'm
That's
glad
right.
that we could have one tonight.
Oh, me too. You're an angel. Okay, I'm pretty sure we'll have to do this again. And so I'm so grateful to you. Thank you so much for sharing all your wisdom and your light with all of the amazing people who are going to listen to this. I'm so grateful to you.
I feel honored to have been a part of it. Thanks for asking me, Jess.
Aw, okay, well, you take care, lovely lady.
You too. Have a good night.
You too.
Okay, bye.
Bye.